1 minute ago, another emergency alert flashed across the UK. A new machete gang spotted moving through a residential block, sending entire neighbourhoods into lockdown. People aren't asking if Britain is turning into a war zone anymore. They're asking how long until the streets are completely lost. Tonight, the illusion of safety shattered. Reports have begun erupting across multiple cities within a single hour. Not isolated incidents, not random confrontations. Coordinated movements, groups armed with blades longer than police batons, weaving through crowded streets like they owned them. The country watched in disbelief as footage spread online. Masked figures marching calmly past storefronts, not running, not hiding, but roaming freely, daring anyone to intervene. The police response was immediate, yet desperately thin. Units were deployed, sirens cut through the air, but for every patrol arriving on scene, a new sighting emerged 2 postcodes away. It felt less like a spike in crime and more like a synchronised stress test on the nation's security. Inside living rooms, families bolted doors as helicopters thundered overhead. Officers on the ground described the situation as volatile, a word used when they can't say the truth out loud. By the time the clock struck 8:16 p.m, 3 separate boroughs had reported violent clashes, windows shattered under the pressure of terrified crowds rushing for cover. Police cordons set up minutes earlier were already struggling to hold back swarms of panicked residents demanding answers. The fear spreading wasn't just of the gangs themselves, but of something far darker, the sense that the state could no longer guarantee control. As tensions climbed, the Home Office insisted there was no systemic threat, a statement that only fueled public outrage. People weren't buying the reassurances anymore. Social feeds exploded with videos showing officers being forced to retreat after being surrounded by groups wielding improvised weapons and fireworks. Scenes that once belonged in documentaries about foreign conflict zones were now unfolding in major British cities. The government urged citizens to remain calm. But calm had evaporated hours ago. At 8:42 p.m, the situation crossed a line. A convoy of police vans attempting to seal off a high-risk zone was ambushed. Fireworks were launched directly at the windshields, igniting in violent bursts of white and red light. Officers scrambled for cover as the street lit up like a battlefield. For the first time in years, tactical units were ordered to reinforce frontline police, not because of terrorism, not because of political riots, but because the streets had descended into total uncontrollable mayhem. Meanwhile, emergency lines overflowed. Thousands of calls per minute, parents reporting strange figures near school gates, shopkeepers begging for help as looters moved in behind the chaos. The nation's trust in its institutions, already fragile, shattered completely. Analysts warned that tonight might mark the beginning of a deeper collapse. Not sudden, but gradual, as organised groups realised just how quickly they could overwhelm law enforcement. Commentators tried to pinpoint the cause: overcrowded prisons, understaffed police forces, a legal system stretched thin, endless bureaucratic delays, and a political class more concerned with debating terminology than restoring order. But for the people trapped inside their homes, listening to sirens echo through the night, none of that mattered. All they saw was a government struggling to maintain control while the streets shifted into something unrecognisable. Whether officials admitted it or not, the balance of power was beginning to tilt. By 9 p.m, one fact had become impossible to deny. Britain was facing a coordinated wave of street violence unlike anything in recent memory. The machete gangs weren't acting like criminals dodging capture. They were acting like they knew the system couldn't stop them. And that single realisation ripped through the public consciousness like an electric shock. Because if groups of masked men could roam a major Western nation with open blades and walk away untouched, then the question wasn't whether UK streets were becoming war zones. The question was how soon the government would admit it. By 9:11 p.m, the situation had spiralled far beyond anything police commanders expected. Dispatch centres reported a surge in coordinated flash mobs forming around transport hubs. Trains were halted mid-route as frightened passengers refused to disembark, choosing to remain locked inside carriages, already trembling from the chaos outside. Officers arriving at stations found platforms littered with abandoned bags, dropped phones, and scattered belongings left behind by people who ran for their lives. The gangs moved with eerie precision, slipping through alleyways and side streets with an awareness of police blind spots that suggested planning rather than spontaneity. Every time a unit attempted to corner one group, another incident erupted 2 miles away. It was a pattern that made Britain's largest cities feel less like metropolitan centres and more like contested zones in a conflict that no one had declared. Government officials released a second statement urging the public not to exaggerate isolated disturbances, but the phrase instantly triggered a national backlash. Commentators accused the administration of downplaying a crisis unfolding in real time. Retired officers openly criticised the leadership, warning that the government was treating a battlefield scenario like a public relations exercise. In several boroughs, locals reported barricading their own streets after waiting more than an hour for emergency response teams. Videos surfaced of residents dragging dumpsters across intersections to form makeshift barriers. Others stood watch with nothing more than kitchen stools, umbrellas and torches, determined not to let roaming groups step into their neighbourhoods without resistance. It was the kind of imagery that once belonged to documentaries about collapsing states. Yet here it was, happening under the glow of London streetlights. Inside police headquarters, commanders faced impossible choices. They had fewer officers than the crisis demanded, fewer vehicles than the chaos required, and fewer tactical options than the law allowed. Every strategy they attempted collapsed under the speed and unpredictability of the disturbances. Officers were already stretched thin from previous weeks of unrest, and morale teetered on the edge. Body cam footage leaked from the front line showed exhausted constables shielding civilians with their own bodies while firecrackers exploded inches away. The footage travelled across social media within minutes, igniting outrage, grief and fury, FIFA in equal measure. How could one of the most developed nations in the world allow its protectors to be overwhelmed in the streets they swore to defend? But the most alarming development of the night appeared at 9:27 p.m, when drones flying over a major district captured footage showing multiple groups converging in a synchronised pattern. They weren't fleeing. They weren't fighting each other. They were moving together. Analysts watching the live feed immediately understood the implication. These gangs weren't opportunists taking advantage of chaos. They were testing the limits of state response. The pattern resembled probing tactics used to map weaknesses, stretch resources and overwhelm defences. It was a chilling realisation, one that senior security advisors privately described as a red flag moment. If groups of street criminals were adopting tactics normally associated with coordinated extremist behaviour, then law enforcement was dealing with a threat that could not be solved by routine arrests or polite press conferences. Meanwhile, the public's frustration boiled over. For weeks, citizens had been reassured that the surge in violence was under control. Yet tonight proved the opposite. Critics blasted the government for refusing to introduce emergency measures or expand police powers. They claimed political leaders were playing linguistic games, debating terminology, arguing over definitions, focusing on optics while communities endured nightly terror. Comment threads filled with messages from parents terrified for their children, workers afraid to commute home, and business owners watching their livelihoods crumble as foot traffic evaporated. Entire districts began shutting down earlier than usual, not because of curfews, but because people no longer trusted the streets after sunset. The message from the public grew clearer by the minute. They felt abandoned. They believed the government had underestimated the crisis, underestimated the level of coordination behind the violence, and underestimated the fear gripping the nation. Security experts warned that the longer the state appeared hesitant, the more emboldened these roaming groups would become. Confidence in policing is like a fragile thread. Once it snaps, rebuilding it becomes a monumental task. And tonight that thread was fraying at an alarming rate. By 9:50 p.m, no reassurances, no statements, no press briefings could mask what millions were seeing with their own eyes. Major stretches of urban Britain were experiencing the kind of disorder usually associated with failed policing models, not modern Western governance. The streets didn't just feel dangerous, they felt abandoned, contested, up for grabs. And as the gangs continued to move unchallenged, the chilling question grew louder across the nation. If this is what a single by 10:03 p.m., a new layer of crisis began unfolding, quieter than the street clashes, yet far more dangerous. Internal reports from emergency control rooms revealed that officers were no longer simply responding to incidents. They were prioritising which neighbourhoods to protect because they no longer had the manpower to cover the entire map. It was a triage approach, something traditionally used in wartime situations, where whole districts were temporarily written off simply because resources had collapsed under the pressure. In some areas, residents realised they were effectively on their own. Calls to emergency numbers were met with automated messages warning of unprecedented delays, a phrase that chilled callers more than silence ever could. It was the first time in recent memory that the public watched the backbone of national security visibly strain in real time. At 10:19 p.m, the crisis took yet another turn when power flickered in several densely populated neighbourhoods. The outages lasted only minutes, but those minutes were enough to send shockwaves across already stressed communities. Panic spread as people rushed to check windows and bolt doors, fearing that the roaming groups might exploit the darkness. Supermarkets pulled down metal shutters, petrol stations locked their entrances, small corner shops closed mid-transaction, leaving baskets and half-scanned items scattered across countertops. Streets that were bustling hours earlier had emptied into a ghostly stillness, broken only by the occasional crack of fireworks or the distant wail of sirens. Officers later admitted that the power dips, though unrelated, magnified the fear tenfold, creating the impression that the gangs were operating with strategic intent. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The psychological impact was devastating. The government attempted to regain public confidence by announcing that reinforcements were being dispatched. Yet viewers watching the late-night broadcast felt the statement lacked urgency. There were no details, no numbers, no specifics. Just vague assurances delivered from behind polished podiums far from the chaos. Citizens scrolling through live feeds saw a different reality. They saw officers retreating behind shields as firecrackers detonated at their feet. They saw ambulances weaving through stampedes of panicked civilians. They saw neighbourhoods forming volunteer patrols, armed with nothing more than whistles, flashlights, and the desperate conviction that someone had to hold the line. The contrast between official messaging and lived experience deepened the public's suspicion that the government was losing control faster than it could admit. At 10:41 p.m, analysts tracking the roaming groups noticed something unsettling. The gangs, which earlier appeared scattered and chaotic, were now moving with increasing discipline. They weren't rampaging randomly, they were testing boundaries, approaching police lines only to withdraw seconds before officers could engage. It was a method designed to wear down response teams, drain their stamina, and stretch command centres to the breaking point. This shift suggested the presence of leadership, someone guiding the movements from behind the scenes. Security experts monitoring surveillance footage described the patterns as probing behaviour, the kind used to gauge how long it would take for a nation's defences to buckle. For the first time tonight, officials privately admitted that this was no longer just a crime wave. It was something far more organised, far more deliberate, and far more coordinated than the public had been told. By 11 p.m, a new wave of distressing reports hit the emergency channels. Several hospitals declared themselves overwhelmed, not from casualties alone, but from the flood of terrified people seeking safety inside medical centres. Families arrived begging staff to let them wait in hallways until police could secure their streets. Security guards struggled to hold the entrances as crowds surged forward. Inside waiting rooms, doctors and nurses worked through what they later described as urban crisis conditions, treating injuries while comforting children trembling from the trauma of the night. The healthcare system was never designed to function as a substitute for public security, yet tonight it was forced into that role. The crisis had spilled into every corner of national infrastructure.